The morning sun cast long shadows across the USS Constellation's flight deck when Lieutenant Commander Myra, Bloodline, Kowalski stepped out of her quarters for what would become the most scrutinized mission briefing of her career. The salt air carried whispers that had been circulating for weeks, rumors of a pilot who shouldn't be there, who had somehow clawed her way into the most elite squadron in the Pacific Fleet through connections nobody could prove but everyone suspected. The F-18 Super Hornets gleamed like predatory birds in the dawn light, their engines cold, but their presence commanding respect from every soul aboard the carrier. What the assembled pilots didn't know as they gathered in the briefing room was that in exactly 72 hours, one of them would be dead, another would be missing, and the woman they had spent months undermining would become the only thing standing between their squadron and complete annihilation. The mission parameters seemed routine. A standard patrol over contested waters near the South China Sea. Nothing the Thunder Eagles hadn't handled 100 times before. But intelligence reports had been filtering in about unusual submarine activity, and the brass had that particular tension in their voices that suggested they knew more than they were sharing. Commander Jake Reaper Morrison stood at the front of the room, his weathered face bearing the kind of scars that come from 20 years of carrier operations. His eyes swept across the assembled pilots, lingering just a moment too long on Kowalski, who sat in the back row with the kind of perfect posture that screamed military academy training. The other pilots, call signs like Hammer, Snake, and Viper, had arranged themselves in their usual formation, a subtle but deliberate exclusion that had become as routine as their pre-flight checks. "Thunder Eagles," Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived more dogfights than most pilots ever saw. "Today's mission takes us into waters that have been heating up for the past month. Intelligence suggests increased submarine activity from what we'll diplomatically call unknown contacts operating in international waters." The projector flickered to life, showing satellite images of dark shapes beneath the ocean's surface, shadows that could have been whales or something far more dangerous. The briefing continued with mechanical precision, covering flight paths, communication protocols, and engagement rules that everyone had memorized but still needed to hear. What nobody mentioned was the elephant in the room. The fact that Bloodline had been assigned to the mission despite being the newest member of the squadron, despite the grumbling from pilots who had been waiting years for such an opportunity, and despite the persistent rumors that her call sign wasn't earned through aerial prowess, but through family connections that reached back to conflicts most of them had only read about in history books. Lieutenant Marcus Falcon Chen caught Morrison's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward Kowalski. The gesture was subtle enough to miss unless you knew what to look for, but it carried the weight of months of accumulated resentment. These men had flown together through training exercises and real combat, had saved each other's lives, and shared the kind of bond that comes from trusting someone with your life at 30,000 feet. To them, Kowalski was an outsider, a reminder that merit didn't always determine who got to wear the wings. The morning briefing concluded with the standard warnings about weather conditions and enemy capabilities. But the real tension in the room had nothing to do with foreign threats, and everything to do with the woman who gathered her flight gear with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. As the pilots filed out toward their aircraft, the whispers began again, quiet speculation about whether Bloodline would crack under pressure, whether she had the ice in her veins that carrier operations demanded, whether she deserved to be there at all. The F-18 Super Hornet, designated Thunder Eagle 7, sat on the deck like a technological marvel, its twin engines capable of pushing 50,000 pounds of aircraft through the sky at speeds that reduced entire continents to mere hours of flight time. The aircraft's gray skin bore the scars of countless missions, small nicks from debris, discoloration from extreme temperatures, and the kind of wear that spoke to a machine that had been tested beyond its limits and emerged victorious. This would be Kowalski's bird for the mission, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by the crew chiefs who had been working on these aircraft since before she had earned her wings. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez approached her with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed his skepticism. "Ma'am, she's fueled and ready. All systems green, weapons load verified." His voice carried the respect due to any pilot about to take his aircraft into harm's way. But there was something else there. A reservation that suggested he, like everyone else, was waiting to see if she measured up to the legacy of pilots who had flown this particular aircraft before her. The pre-flight inspection took on ritual significance as Kowalski walked around the aircraft, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over control surfaces, weapon mountings, and sensor arrays. Each check was performed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she understood exactly what was at stake, not just her own life, but the lives of every pilot who would fly with her, and the reputation of a squadron that had built its identity on excellence and brotherhood. As she climbed into the cockpit, the weight of expectations settled around her like the familiar embrace of her flight suit. The instruments glowed with electronic precision, each display showing systems that represented millions of hours of engineering and testing. The helmet communication system crackled to life as she began her startup sequence, the familiar voices of her squadron mates filling the air with the kind of professional chatter that preceded every mission. But beneath the routine calls and responses, she could hear it, the slight pause before acknowledging her transmissions, the way conversations seemed to halt when she keyed her microphone. The catapult shot from the carrier deck was a controlled explosion of physics and engineering, 4 seconds of acceleration that compressed the human body against the seat with enough force to blur vision and test the limits of consciousness. For those 4 seconds, every pilot was alone with their aircraft and their training, trusting that the thousands of hours of preparation would overcome the natural human instinct to panic when subjected to forces that evolution never intended. Kowalski felt the familiar push of acceleration, the moment when the aircraft transitioned from a piece of machinery tied to the deck to an instrument of flight capable of defying gravity itself. "Thunder Eagle 7, you are airborne and looking good," came the voice of the air traffic controller, professional and reassuring. The formation took shape around her as the other F-18s climbed to their assigned altitude, their engines creating contrails that dissipated into the morning sky like temporary scars on the atmosphere. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below them, a blue expanse that could hide entire fleets beneath its surface or swallow aircraft that suffered mechanical failures without leaving any trace of their existence. The flight toward their patrol area was conducted in relative silence, each pilot monitoring their instruments and maintaining formation with the kind of precision that had been drilled into them through countless hours of training. The aircraft moved through the sky with predatory grace, their radar systems sweeping the horizon for any sign of activity that might indicate a threat. The silence was broken only by routine position reports and system checks, the kind of professional communication that kept formations intact and missions on schedule. But as they approached the coordinates where intelligence had indicated unusual activity, the tenor of the mission began to change. The first sign of trouble came through the electronic warfare systems, subtle indications that they were being painted by radar systems that weren't supposed to be in the area. The signatures were faint but unmistakable, the electronic fingerprints of advanced military equipment operating in what was supposed to be international waters. "Thunder Eagle Leader, this is 7. I'm picking up intermittent radar contacts bearing 020, approximately 50 miles out." Kowalski's voice was calm and professional, but there was an edge to it that suggested she had seen something that didn't match the intelligence briefing they had received that morning. The other pilots immediately began cross-referencing their own sensor readings, trying to confirm or deny what their newest squadron member had reported. The response came back with a hint of skepticism that would have been imperceptible to anyone not listening for it. "Thunder Eagle 7, Thunder Eagle Leader, can you confirm the nature of those contacts? We're not seeing anything definitive on our scopes." The implication was clear. Either her equipment was malfunctioning, or she was seeing threats where none existed. For a pilot already fighting for acceptance within the squadron, being wrong about a contact report would be a career-defining mistake. The electronic warfare officer aboard the carrier had been monitoring the same frequencies, and his voice cut through the squadron chatter with the kind of authority that comes from years of experience reading the electronic battlefield. Thunder Eagle Flight. This is Constellation. We're showing multiple surface contacts in your area. Classification unknown. Recommend you proceed with caution and maintain current altitude. The confirmation should have vindicated Kowalski's initial report, but instead it seemed to heighten the tension within the formation. What happened next would be analyzed and debated in military academies for years to come. The radar contacts that had been intermittent suddenly became solid, revealing themselves as a small fleet of vessels that had been operating under electronic camouflage, sophisticated enough to fool most detection systems. The ships were sleek and modern, with the kind of angular design that suggested they had been built with stealth characteristics in mind. Their weapons systems were trained skyward, and their positioning indicated they had been waiting for exactly this kind of patrol to venture into their operating area. The lead vessel launched what appeared to be a surface-to-air missile, its exhaust trail visible against the blue sky like a deadly punctuation mark. The missile climbed rapidly, its guidance system locked onto the heat signature of the F-18 formation. The electronic warfare systems aboard the aircraft screamed warnings as the missile approached, its proximity triggering automatic defensive measures that filled the sky with chaff and flares designed to confuse incoming weapons. Thunder Eagle Flight break formation. We have incoming SAM. Repeat, incoming surface-to-air missile. The professional calm of the radio chatter evaporated as the pilots executed evasive maneuvers that had been practiced thousands of times, but never under live fire conditions. The F-18s scattered like startled birds, their engines screaming as they pulled G-forces that pushed human endurance to its limits. The missile, confused by the defensive measures, detonated harmlessly several thousand feet away. But its message was clear. This was no longer a routine patrol. The engagement that followed lasted exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds, but those minutes would define not just the mission, but the entire future of the Thunder Eagle Squadron. The surface vessels had been positioned to create a kill zone, their overlapping fields of fire designed to trap any aircraft that entered their area of operations. The pilots found themselves fighting not just for their own lives, but for the tactical advantage that would allow them to escape and report what they had discovered. Kowalski's voice cut through the chaos with the kind of clarity that comes from someone who has trained for exactly this moment. Thunder Eagle Leader, Thunder Eagle 7. I have a firing solution on the lead vessel. Request permission to engage. The formal language of military communication couldn't hide the fact that she was asking for permission to start a shooting war with an unidentified enemy in international waters. The decision would carry political implications that reached far beyond the cockpit of a single F-18. The response came back after a pause that seemed to last forever, but was actually less than 3 seconds. Thunder Eagle 7, you are cleared to engage. Take the shot. The words carried the weight of command decision, the moment when a training mission transformed into actual combat. The AGM-88 HARM missile dropped from Kowalski's aircraft with mechanical precision, its guidance system immediately acquiring the radar signature of the lead vessel. The missile struck the enemy ship with devastating effect, its high-explosive warhead detonating against the vessel's superstructure and sending a pillar of smoke and flame into the sky. The explosion seemed to break the spell that had held the other enemy vessels in their defensive positions, and suddenly the entire fleet was moving, their formation dissolving as they attempted to evade the remaining American aircraft. But the victory was short-lived. The surface vessels had been a diversion, a tactic designed to draw the F-18s down to lower altitude where they would be vulnerable to the real threat. The submarine that had been lurking beneath the surface launched a spread of missiles from its vertical launch system, weapons that had been designed specifically to engage aircraft operating at low altitude. The missiles rose from the water like mechanical sharks, their guidance systems locked onto the heat signatures of the F-18s. Thunder Eagle 3 took the first hit, Lieutenant Hammer Davidson's aircraft disintegrating in a ball of fire that left no doubt about the pilot's fate. The explosion sent shockwaves through the formation, the reality of combat hitting home in the most brutal way possible. These weren't training exercises with predetermined outcomes. This was warfare where mistakes were measured in lives and defeat meant never going home. The remaining pilots found themselves in a running battle with an enemy that had prepared for exactly this kind of engagement. The submarine had surfaced partially, its missile tubes continuing to launch weapons that turned the sky into a deadly maze of explosions and debris. The F-18s were forced to fly defensive patterns that limited their ability to counterattack, their primary concern becoming survival rather than victory. Thunder Eagle 5 disappeared into a cloud of smoke and debris. Lieutenant Commander Snake, Williams' aircraft victim, to a missile that had been tracking him for nearly 30 seconds. The pilot's voice cut out in mid-transmission, leaving only static where there had been a human being moments before. The squadron that had taken off as 8 aircraft was now down to 6, and the enemy showed no signs of slowing their attack. It was at this moment that Kowalski made the decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of continuing the defensive pattern that was slowly bleeding the squadron to death, she broke formation and dove toward the submarine, her aircraft's nose pointing directly at the enemy vessel. The maneuver was tactically unsound, strategically questionable, and absolutely necessary if any of them were going to survive the next 5 minutes. Thunder Eagle 7, what are you doing? Return to formation. The voice of Thunder Eagle leader carried the authority of command, but it also carried the desperation of a pilot who had watched two of his men die in the space of 3 minutes. The order was clear, but so was the tactical situation. Continuing their current course would result in the complete destruction of the squadron. Kowalski's response came back with the kind of calm that suggested she had already accepted the likely outcome of her decision. Thunder Eagle leader, someone needs to take out that submarine. I'm going in. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a combat pilot's ultimate commitment, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the mission and the lives of her squadron mates. The dive toward the submarine was a controlled fall through increasingly dangerous airspace, missiles and anti-aircraft fire creating a deadly obstacle course that required split-second timing and absolute precision. The F-18's airframe groaned under the stress of the maneuver, its engineers never having imagined that their aircraft would be subjected to such punishment. The submarine grew larger in her targeting display as she approached, its details becoming clear enough to see individual crew members scrambling across its deck. The torpedo that had been aimed at the submarine launched from her aircraft at the last possible moment, its guidance system acquiring the large metal target with mechanical satisfaction. The weapon struck the submarine just aft of the conning tower, its warhead detonating with enough force to lift the enemy vessel partially out of the water. The explosion sent a column of water and debris skyward, and when it cleared, the submarine was listing heavily to port, its missile launches ceasing as the crew fought to save their vessel. But the victory came at a price that would haunt Kowalski for years to come. The explosion had damaged her aircraft's hydraulic system, and she was now flying a machine that responded to her controls with the sluggishness of something that was slowly bleeding to death. The other pilots in the formation could see the damage, could hear the strain in her voice as she fought to maintain control of an aircraft that was becoming increasingly difficult to fly. Thunder Eagle 7, this is Thunder Eagle leader. What's your status? The question carried more than professional concern. It carried the weight of a commanding officer who had just watched one of his pilots risk everything to save the rest of the squadron. The skepticism that had colored his earlier communications was gone, replaced by the kind of respect that could only be earned through combat. The response came back with the kind of professional calm that belied the severity of her situation. Thunder Eagle leader, I've got hydraulic problems and some control issues, but I'm still flying. The submarine is out of action, and I'm not seeing any more missile launches. The understatement was typical of military communication, but everyone listening knew that some control issues in a damaged F-18 was often a euphemism for a pilot fighting for her life. The flight back to the carrier took place in formation, with the remaining aircraft surrounding Kowalski's damaged F-18 like a protective escort. The camaraderie that had been absent during the morning briefing was now evident in every radio transmission, every formation adjustment, every gesture of support that could be communicated through the movement of aircraft. The woman who had been an outsider 8 hours earlier was now the pilot who had saved their lives. The approach to the carrier was complicated by the damage to her aircraft, the hydraulic problems making it difficult to maintain the precise control necessary for a successful landing. The landing signal officer aboard the Constellation had been monitoring her approach, his voice providing the kind of guidance that could mean the difference between a safe landing and a catastrophic crash. The other pilots maintained their formation until the last possible moment, their presence a reminder that she was no longer flying alone. The landing was rough but successful, her F-18 catching the arresting wire with a violence that spoke to the damage the aircraft had sustained. The crew that surrounded her aircraft as she shut down the engines worked with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of experience, their actions speaking to the respect they had developed for any pilot who brought back a damaged aircraft. The woman who climbed out of the cockpit was the same person who had stepped into it hours earlier. But something fundamental had changed in the way others looked at her. The debriefing that followed was conducted with the kind of professional thoroughness that such incidents demanded. But beneath the formal questions and answers was a recognition that something significant had occurred. The intelligence gathered from the engagement would be analyzed for months. The tactical lessons learned would be incorporated into training programs, and the political implications would be debated at levels far above the squadron level. But for the pilots who had been there, who had seen their squadron mates die, and had been saved by the actions of someone they had spent months dismissing, the most important change was in their understanding of what it meant to be part of the Thunder Eagle Squadron. The call sign, Bloodline, had been earned not through family connections or political influence, but through the kind of combat leadership that defined the best military traditions. Commander Morrison stood before the assembled pilots in the same briefing room where the day had begun, but everything had changed. The morning's skepticism had been replaced by a respect that could only be earned through shared combat experience. The woman who had been an outsider was now part of the brotherhood that defined carrier aviation, her place in the squadron secure not because of what she had inherited, but because of what she had proven. The investigation that followed would reveal the true nature of the enemy forces they had encountered, the political implications of the engagement, and the strategic importance of the intelligence they had gathered. But those revelations would come later, after the dead had been honored and the wounded had been treated. For now, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed, and the knowledge that when the moment had come, every pilot had done what was necessary. The evening sun cast long shadows across the carrier deck as the crew prepared for the night's operations, the rhythm of military life continuing despite the day's losses. The F-18s sat on the deck like sleeping predators, their engines quiet but their presence a reminder of the price of freedom and the courage of those who fly in defense of it. The woman who had been questioned that morning was now part of the legend that would define the Thunder Eagle Squadron for generations to come. The story of that day would be told and retold in ready rooms and officer clubs around the world, the details growing more dramatic with each telling, but the essential truth remaining constant, that courage under fire and competence in combat were the only measures that truly mattered. The call sign, Bloodline, would carry new meaning, not as a reminder of family connections, but as a symbol of the kind of leadership that emerges when everything is on the line. The personnel files would be updated, the combat records would be entered, and the official reports would be filed in archives that historians would study for decades to come. But the most important change was in the hearts and minds of the pilots who had been there, who had learned that heroism comes not from the expectations of others, but from the willingness to risk everything for the people who depend on you. The night operations continued as they always had, pilots launching into the darkness to maintain the vigilance that protected freedom around the world. The carrier moved through the waters of the Pacific like a floating city, its mission unchanged by the events of the day, but its crew forever marked by the courage they had witnessed. The woman who had been questioned that morning was now part of the legacy that defined naval aviation. The dreams that night were filled with the sounds of combat, the image of falling aircraft, and the memory of voices that would never be heard again. But they were also filled with the knowledge that when the moment had come, when everything had been on the line, the right decisions had been made and the right prices had been paid. The squadron would continue, strengthened by the bonds forged in combat and the respect earned through courage. The morning would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that the lessons learned in combat had been absorbed and understood. The woman who had been an outsider would lead those missions, her place in the squadron secure not because of what she had inherited, but because of what she had proven. The call sign, Bloodline, would carry forward, a symbol of everything that was best about the warriors who flew in defense of freedom. The years that followed would bring many changes to the Thunder Eagle Squadron. Pilots would come and go, aircraft would be upgraded and replaced, and new challenges would emerge from an ever-changing world. But the story of that day would remain constant, a reminder that courage and competence were the only measures that truly mattered, and that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely places. The legacy of Lieutenant Commander Myra, Bloodline, Kowalski would extend far beyond that single day, influencing training programs, tactical doctrines, and the culture of naval aviation itself. Her story would be told to new generations of pilots, not as an example of what women could achieve in combat, but as an example of what any pilot could achieve when training, courage, and dedication combined at the crucial moment. The final lesson of that day was perhaps the most important, that the warrior's code transcended gender, background, and preconceptions, that the only thing that mattered in combat was the willingness to risk everything for the mission and the people who depended on you. The woman who had been questioned that morning had provided the answer through her actions, and that answer would echo through the halls of naval aviation for generations to come. The Thunder Eagle Squadron would continue to fly, its mission unchanged, but its understanding deepened by the events of that day. The pilots who had been there would carry the memory forward, sharing the lessons learned and the respect earned through shared combat experience. The call sign Bloodline would remain part of the squadron's heritage, a symbol of the courage and competence that defined the best of naval aviation. The story ends where it began, with the morning sun casting long shadows across the carrier deck and pilots preparing for another day of operations. But everything had changed, the skepticism replaced by respect, the questions answered through action, and the outsider transformed into a leader. The woman who had been questioned that morning had become part of the legend that would define the Thunder Eagle Squadron for all time. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly around the carrier, its blue depths hiding secrets that would never be fully understood. But on the deck of the USS Constellation, in the ready rooms where pilots gathered for their briefings, and in the hearts of the men and women who flew in defense of freedom, the story of that day would live forever. The call sign, Bloodline, had earned its place in the history of naval aviation, not through inheritance, but through the kind of courage that defined the warrior's code. The final words of the story belong not to any individual pilot, but to the squadron itself, to the tradition of excellence that had been tested and proven once again. The Thunder Eagle Squadron would continue to fly, its mission unchanged, but its bonds strengthened by the events of that day. The woman who had been an outsider that morning was now part of the brotherhood that defined carrier aviation, her place secure not because of what she had inherited, but because of what she had proven when everything was on the line. The legacy would continue, carried forward by new generations of pilots who would learn the lessons of that day and carry them into whatever conflicts the future might bring. The story of Lieutenant Commander Myra, Bloodline, Kowalski would remain a part of that legacy, a reminder that courage and competence were the only measures that truly mattered, and that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely places when the moment demanded it. The sun set on the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded every pilot of the price of freedom and the courage of those who flew in its defense. The carrier moved through the waters like a symbol of American power and determination, its mission unchanged by the events of the day, but its crew forever marked by the courage they had witnessed. The woman who had been questioned that morning was now part of the legend that would define naval aviation for generations to come. And in the quiet moments before sleep, When the sounds of combat faded and the memories of fallen comrades grew dim, the surviving pilots of the Thunder Eagle Squadron would remember not the skepticism of the morning, but the courage of the afternoon, not the questions that had been asked, but the answers that had been given through action. The call sign, Bloodline, would carry forward, a symbol of everything that was best about the warriors who flew in defense of freedom, a reminder that the warrior's code transcended all boundaries, and that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely places when the moment demanded it. The story of that day would be told and retold, its lessons learned and its legacy preserved, a testament to the courage and competence of the men and women who flew in defense of freedom. The Thunder Eagle Squadron would continue its mission, strengthened by the bonds forged in combat and the respect earned through courage. The woman who had been an outsider that morning was now part of the brotherhood that defined carrier aviation, her place secure not because of what she had inherited, but because of what she had proven when everything was on the line. The final lesson of that day was perhaps the most important, that the warrior's code transcended all boundaries, that courage and competence were the only measures that truly mattered, and that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely places when the moment demanded it. The call sign, Bloodline, had earned its place in the history of naval aviation, not through inheritance, but through the kind of courage that defined the warrior's code, and the dedication that separated the merely competent from the truly exceptional. The Thunder Eagle Squadron would fly again, its mission unchanged, but its understanding deepened by the events of that day. The pilots who had been there would carry the memory forward, sharing the lessons learned and the respect earned through shared combat experience. The woman who had been questioned that morning had become part of the legend that would define the squadron for all time. Her story a reminder that the warrior's code knew no boundaries, and that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely places when the moment demanded it. The story ends as it began, with the understanding that courage and competence were the only measures that truly mattered, and that the warrior's code transcended all boundaries. The call sign, Bloodline, would remain part of the squadron's heritage, a symbol of the courage and dedication that defined the best of naval aviation. The woman who had been an outsider that morning was now part of the brotherhood that defined carrier aviation, her place secure not because of what she had inherited, but because of what she had proven when everything was on the line. The legacy would continue, carried forward by new generations of pilots who would learn the lessons of that day and carry them into whatever conflicts the future might bring. The story of Lieutenant Commander Myra, Bloodline, Kowalski would remain a part of that legacy, a reminder that courage and competence were the only measures that truly mattered, and that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely places when the moment demanded it. The Thunder Eagle Squadron would continue to fly, its mission unchanged, but its bonds strengthened by the events of that day, a testament to the courage and dedication of the men and women who flew in defense of freedom.